This podcast is presented by the Verizon Partner Network.
Hello and welcome to Encrypted, brought to you by Verizon. I'm James Kent, and joining me today is Christopher Novak. Christopher is the Global Director of the Threat Research Advisory Center with Verizon, and he's our resident cybersecurity guru. It's always a pleasure getting Chris's insights on the latest in cybersecurity trends and discussing what's happening out in the world from a security standpoint. And there is a lot going on these days, so I'm super excited to start this conversation. Chris, hello, how are you? What's going on?
Doing well, James. Thanks so much. Always a pleasure to be here, and there's a lot going on, so I look forward to the conversation.
Yes, so off the bat, I want to know, Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp app, they all went down on Monday, October 4th for over 6 hours. Facebook claims it was a self-inflicted problem and not a hack. But just a day before, there was the whistleblower interview on 60 Minutes. So, is it a coincidence? I don't know. Do we believe them? Give me your thoughts.
Well, you make a great point there, and it's interesting because from a security background, we are always looking at the potential for there to be a hack and attack kind of angle to just about everything. And so naturally, when these big outages occur, especially at big names like Facebook and Instagram or WhatsApp, sites that people think are, it's like the sun, it is always there, and these
Yes.
these services are always online, So when they go down, obviously they attract a lot of attention. So we definitely looked at it from that angle, but we have no reason to believe it was anything other than what they claimed. The reality of it is, if you operate a large scale network infrastructure environment, or in this case, a lot of very popular apps, there is the potential for there to be outages and especially misconfigurations. Misconfiguration, usually a human error, it can lead to fairly catastrophic failures if there's not the right, checks and safeguards in place. And I think ultimately that is most likely what happened here. We have no reason to believe or intelligence that tells us that it was anything of a security nature and that it wasn't just a misconfiguration. But obviously, when we see things like this, it also highlights the need for, what are these organizations doing to ensure that, they are operating their systems and their apps in a manner that, keeps them up and operational.
Well, we'll check back on this in about 6 months, and maybe we'll have to do a follow-up one. But, regardless if it was a hack or if it was an internal issue, no matter what, as you just said, it raises an important question, and that is we, from a personal level, are all reliant on certain applications that we use every day on our mobile devices. And do these apps pose risks? If so, what are the biggest risks we should be worried about, and what can we do about it?
Sure.
Chris, I'm all ears.
So I would say that you're absolutely right. There are risks posed by any app that anybody uses. I would say usually the biggest things that are of concern is around things like data privacy. It's what information do you put into or share with the app? I think a lot of people inherently trust their phones, and not that there's anything inherently untrustworthy about a phone, but when you start installing all these third-party apps that, kind of the old conversation used to be, if you don't need to pay for something, then you're the product, right? That's what they would often say. And so, when you look at these apps that are all free, you have to ask yourself, how is it that they make money? And in most of these cases, they make money by doing something as it relates to your usage patterns, your data, your preferences, because a lot of it is driven by, marketing and advertising dollars. And so I think there's a lot that individuals need to ask themselves when they choose to install an app or interact with an app is, largely around what data about them are they comfortable sharing? And, the view of it I always have is, if you're okay with whatever that information is eventually becoming public, whether the organization publishes it or they get hacked and it gets out, think about it through that lens, and you may think twice about what kind of information or messages you elect to share, because there is the potential for what you think is private to potentially become public. So I would say that those are probably the biggest things around, the data privacy and I think the assumption that a lot of people have that, well, I'm just talking to this person and they're not going to do anything with that information, but that data is also in an app, across a network, in someone's storage system somewhere, and all of those have risks.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we get these agreement statements whenever we install these things, and we usually just, how fast can we click yes so that we can get to using it. But, the things that you just talked about with data and security brings up the big thing that just happened right before the Facebook incident that went down a couple of weeks ago. At home one night, and my wife is frantically grabbing all the Apple devices in the home, and we have a lot of them. And she informs me we have to update our software right away due to a very serious security risk, which I believe was dubbed CVE-2021-30860. And I don't want to spoil all the fun here, so why don't you explain what CVE-2021 and 5 more digits after that is, why it's so dangerous, how does something like this get into our devices, and what, if anything, can we do about it besides being vulnerable until it's either too late or we get a software patch?
Yeah, great question. So CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. And typically this is a label that is given to, it can be a device, a piece of software. Essentially, if you think of it as there is some identified problem that needs to be resolved that could result in, privacy or security issues for the user, kind of almost akin to like you'd think of, if your car was being recalled for a safety issue. This is similar to that for security and privacy as it relates to, oftentimes, software applications and devices. And they're sequentially numbered as they're identified. So that's how the numbering schema works. And ultimately what this one is, the one that you mentioned, that one actually goes back to a vulnerability within Apple devices that allows for someone to send you a message and you don't have to do anything with it. Just the fact that they sent the message can exploit this weakness in the device, which then would allow them to be able to do whatever they want. So in this case with these CVEs, and in particular the one that you mentioned, when they take advantage of that, they are typically using that in order to further additional activity. So they get access to your phone, and then they may install some kind of malware that collects data, or it may collect your phone logs. It may collect your pictures. It could collect really anything that is on or that you use your device for. It can even do things like listen to your microphone. So if you have your phone just sitting on your desk, it can just be sending whatever audio it hears to somebody anywhere in the world. Same thing with the camera or things that you've already done with your device. So that's really where the concern comes in, is that you don't even necessarily know that this phone in the room may now be a recording device. And, some people may say, hey, they're not terribly worried about it. They have, nothing to hide. I would bet most people, if they didn't know that their device might be recording them, they might do different things with their devices. And then you also have concerns around, journalists, activists, people who may be in, particularly dangerous situations from time to time. The ability for their device to be tampered with in that manner, could also present real, serious life and safety concerns.
Is there anything, you mentioned that it has to be a message sent. If you were concerned, is there anything that you can look at to say, oh, this must have been the message, or is that also very hard to detect?
Unfortunately, with some of them can be very hard to detect. Some of them are actually almost completely undetectable to the random, everyday user, which is unfortunate because usually everyone says, hey, well, what can I do? And in some of these cases, the answer may be you only can wait for the vendor to release an update, which is obviously very unfortunate. What I always encourage people to do is try to stay on the forefront of understanding what these are, right? The fact that your wife identified it so quickly and ran around the house grabbing the devices, it's good that she was plugged in and understood this was a concern. The first thing you're going to want to look to do when you hear about one of these is identify whether or not the vendor has released a patch or an update, just like a recall for your car. Get it in and get it fixed as quickly as possible, deploy the patch, and that generally solves the biggest part of the problem. A lot of vendors, if they don't have a patch immediately available, because sometimes it may take them, days or weeks to figure out how that problem manifested and then how to fix it. What they will also sometimes do is release workarounds. So they may say, look, while we don't have a patch that fixes this, if you go into settings, click here, and just turn this feature off until the patch is available, you at least won't be vulnerable, because most of these vulnerabilities are taking advantage of some feature that if you turn the feature off, you're not vulnerable with that feature disabled. It's just a question of whether or not people feel like they can live without that feature for the period of time until the patch comes out.
Another follow-up on that. So say your phone was infected, whether you knew it or not, and you got this recent patch to solve the problem. If you had been infected, would that patch shut that off? Or is your phone, once it's infected, it's still infected?
Oh, very good question. So that is going to depend on the nature of the infection, unfortunately. So in a lot of cases, the patch will solve the initial problem. But if someone already exploited the device, then there may be other problems that come on from it. And generally what I would recommend people have in place is some form of like app scanning or antivirus, just like we used to have in the traditional days of, laptops and desktop computers. You'd have antivirus that would check to see. And the idea there then would be is even if your device was exploited and the patch now makes it not exploitable, it would at least be able to look and see whether or not something else was added to your device that would concern you.
One thing I think it's critical to point out here, an attack like this one that happened with Apple costs millions of dollars to develop. And once it's uncovered and the solution is installed, that the shelf life of that attack is pretty limited. That means it's probably sponsored by some pretty deep-pocketed cyber actors with a purpose to either target specific individuals. You would just mention journalists or information. Now that sounds kind of James Bondish to me, but it's actually is the real world. What is going on behind the curtain of these actions? I mean, who's sponsoring and what are they hoping to gain? I mean, is it that kind of thing with journalists get inside information or what other things are happening there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say you're absolutely right in that a lot of these are deep pockets. In fact, our research has shown that about 80% of these events are typically by some kind of organized crime group. And if it's not organized crime, then it's, possibly a step even further worse, which is nation state actors, which are even further, or deeper pockets. So you're absolutely right that it takes a lot of effort to build these exploits and go after these targets. And I would say that, there are definitely some where the situation is all about, hey, they are exploiting it because they are trying to get an individual or a group, and they feel that the investment or the expenditure or whatever it is that they need in terms of resources is worth that effort in order to stop this individual or this group that may be, opposed to them. And then a lot of it also is financially motivated. So a lot of what we see that comes from organized crime, they're typically doing it not because they care about you or me as an individual. They just look at it and say, hey, we believe we can target bank A, B, or C's application or data. And if we can get this loaded on your phone, we can get access to your bank account or your brokerage or something else of value. And so if they can get access to that, another big one that we see a lot is cryptocurrency exchanges. If people can get malware loaded on your phone that can then get your authentication token, they may then be able to get into one of your cryptocurrency accounts, and then they will typically move that. And one of the reasons that is also highly targeted is because it's very hard to reverse. Once it is moved, It is very hard to get it back.
I know somebody that happened to.
Unfortunate.
Chris, while conversing with you is fun, it's a little scary. But the fact of life is we all rely on our phones for so many things. I mean, it's pretty much a function of our being at this point.
Sure.
But it's concerning that while we are doing all of these things with our mobile devices, unbeknownst to us, someone could be taking all of our valuable information and interactions to use for a variety of purposes, and I'm going to bet the farm that none of them are good. So let's bring this discussion to a happy conclusion if we can.
Sure.
Help me with some other tips and best practices we can do to protect our mobile devices and ourselves from cyber attacks. Understanding that there may be some that we can't prevent until we get a patch.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say a couple of things that immediately come to mind. One would be avoid rooting your device. So if you're not familiar with that, that is in Apple terms, it's also called jailbreaking. And the idea there is you kind of break out of some of the manufacturer's security controls. And by doing so, it allows you to do things with your device that maybe you normally would not be able to do. The downside is if you root the device, you're also removing those protections from you. So if something happens to your device, the security that you would have got by not having rooted it or jailbroken it, you no longer have. So I always tell people, if you don't need to root it for any reason or jailbreak it for any reason, don't, because that at least gives you that Apple or Android level of protection that is built in by the vendor that usually does quite well at keeping out a lot of malicious actions. Another one that I always recommend is multi-factor authentication. Wherever and whenever you can possibly use multi-factor, you want to try to use it this way. If someone does get access to some of your information or they learn your password, that's not enough for them to get into, your accounts or your devices. I would say another one too that is also very important is only installing apps from trusted sources. Yeah. And, I mentioned before, not rooting or jailbreaking your device. This kind of goes along with it. Apple has an app store, Google has the Google Play Store, and there's a handful of others that are very reputable locations in which you can get apps. Now, that doesn't mean that an app still can't have a problem, but it does mean that those vendors who maintain those app stores, they typically are doing some level of scrutiny on the apps that are available in their app stores to ensure that there's a minimum level of risk associated with using them. So I always tell people, try to stick to that. There's a lot of places where you can sideload apps or get apps off websites. I would say that you need to be really cautious about that. It's kind of like the old days of, when you were installing software on your laptop or your desktop, you'd Google for a piece of software and you could buy it from the vendor, or you might see a link here where you can, quote, download it. Now, most of those sites were not legit. They were not legal. And in a lot of cases, you might be able to download a free copy of whatever that software is, but it included malware in the software. And then as a result, you then infected your system. We see the same thing happen in the mobile device world, where if you're not careful where you're getting your apps from, there's the potential you're essentially installing malware on your device for the bad actor. Same thing with thumb drives. We'd always had to be careful about, sticking a thumb drive in our computer that we didn't know where it was from because it might have malware. Same thing with getting apps from places that you don't necessarily know or trust.
And also, 1234 is probably not a password anyone should use.
Yes. Yes.
I think you don't need a Whopper computer from War Games to figure that out. Chris, any final thoughts on what we've been discussing here today? Anything out there has you concerned? Something we should be talking about in terms of cybersecurity and mobile devices that you don't think we're talking enough about, or taking enough precautions to prevent a large-scale incident?
I would say, just a basic, maybe kind of common sense recommendation I'd end with is, if you come across something that seems too good to be true, really give it a second look, because a lot of what we find in terms of these exploits, they're taking advantage of the human factor, human behavior. They are trying to entice people with whether it's a get rich quick, install this app and make some money, and they'll even try to show you proof of, hey, here's all the checks I've cashed. I made millions. All you need to do is do this. And if it seems like it's that good, what they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The same thing here. You need to be really cautious, because most of those are just social engineering angles to get into your device or get into your data. And you're maybe helping them get rich because they're going to siphon out your bank account, but you're definitely not going to be helping yourself get rich.
Agreed. Christopher Novak, the Global Director at the Threat Research Advisory Center with Verizon. It's always a pleasure. If folks are looking to stay informed on what Verizon's up to in the cybersecurity space, where should they go to learn more?
Verizon.com. You can just go there, look at our security pages, and you can learn a lot about what it is that we've been researching and seeing. We also have some monthly webcasts as well on the Bright Talk platform. Feel free to check those out. We talk about kind of new and evolving threats. Everybody's welcome.
Chris, thanks again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, James.
And thank you for tuning in to Encrypted, a cybersecurity podcast brought to you by Verizon. Want more great Verizon cybersecurity content? Subscribe to Encrypted on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We have more shows, more guests, and more Chris coming your way in the near future, so be on the lookout for those. Until then, I'm James Kent, stay safe, stay secure, and let's talk again soon.